You are listening to Missed Apex Podcast. We live F1. Welcome to Missed Apex Podcast. I'm your host, Cristina Mace, stepping in for Spanners, who is still stateside, engaged in some NASCAR in Darlington. Today we have some F1 news, such as the trial of controversial new rain covers, updates to the race rules, expensive lobster rolls, and answering listener feedback. Let us remind you that we are an independent podcast produced in the podcasting shed with the kind support of our patrons and sponsors. We aim to bring you a race review before your Monday morning commute. We might be wrong, but we're first. Welcome back, everybody, to our standard setup. We are no longer on the road. We are back in the shed. Today, we are joined by our two panelists, Scott Tuffey. How are you doing, Scott?
Spanners has got a lot better looking all of a sudden. I'm reveling in I'm still basking in the fact that we have a brand new winner in F1, not just for this season, but ever. So, yeah, lots to talk about this week.
It was definitely a magical thing to behold because if we haven't mentioned it, Missed Apex were in Miami. So if you want to listen to some of that content that we filmed while we were live and in person, it is available. We also have joining us, Brad Philpot. How are we doing today, Brad?
I am now clearly the oldest on the podcast, so that means I get to be the grumpiest about race rules, and I might even just send an inappropriate tweet.
Fabulous. You get old, you get cranky and outdated, and we support your right to do that. And the first thing that we're going to get you both to be cranky about, our pre-race meeting got a little bit derailed because the feelings and the tensions were high, is that we have some updates to driving standards. This past weekend in Miami, we saw a number of incidents where judgments were passed, penalties were given out, and a lot of the people at home were left questioning and wondering why. Then we got a lovely article from the race clarifying why these decisions were made. And in particular, one that I think we'll get quite deeply into was the Magnuson versus Sargent in a chicane incident. It put Sargent out of the race, and Magnuson got a penalty for it. So before we get going into what the rules are now, let's give us a good baseline of what the general rules are for racing, especially, we can give it to my level of knowledge because I know nothing about racing a car. I know how to parallel park though, but racing is a bit of a mystery. So if you guys were to say these are the rules to someone who's a complete beginner, going to jump in a kart for the first time, what would you say?
Wow, that's such a nice, easy topic to have to try and summarize. Thanks for that, Cristina. So I'll take this one since I consider myself a bit of a racecraft and racing etiquette aficionado. So in the most simple terms, you're not allowed to crash into people. That's not very specific, though. That's a bit general. So you then have to dig down and codify it slightly more clearly. So you then have to define what crashing into someone means, how much room do you have to give someone, how much space are they allowed, and that's what the regulations themselves and the guidelines that get issued in Formula One at least try and specify. And I have to also point out that the racing rules in Formula One are specific to Formula One. They're not necessarily the same you'd see in karting, as you mentioned, or any other single-seater series necessarily, although they do quite often eventually filter down to those other series. But Formula One has it issues its own specific guidelines, some of those which have been clarified for this year. Back in 2022, I released a video on my YouTube channel when we all were slightly surprised about penalties either being or not being handed out at Silverstone 2022, when there were examples of drivers being pushed off the track, and we thought we were all of the understanding that that wasn't allowed from 2022. And then it turned out there were some guidelines issued which essentially gave all the power to the car on the inside of a particular corner, as long as the car had a certain amount of its length alongside the defending car, you could then effectively run them off the track on the exit. It really it codified the type of driving we saw Max Verstappen doing in 2021 often in battles with Lewis Hamilton, where he was essentially doing these one corner moves where he'd dive down the inside, push the other driver off, whether it was Lewis or someone else, and then it was let slide most of the time, and that then became the official rule for 2022. But those have now been clarified even further in the article we've seen in the race in the last few days.
Yeah, it's the perfect summary. It's the racing rules. I think we all have our opinion on what they should be like, but as Brad mentions, F1 is very specific. And while I don't have experience of going racing in real life, I've only got sim racing to compare to, and the difference in enjoyment and in viewing factor when you come up against a driver who gives you fair racing room and you go side by side through multiple corners and have those battles that don't just end after one corner is what I personally get pure enjoyment out of from a sim racing perspective, but is what I so want to watch and experience from F1. And unfortunately, with these current racing rules, don't quite entice that, as we saw Carlos Sainz get very angry with at the weekend with that move that Oscar Piastri did down the inside. Sainz was probably very frustrated, and potentially that then led to him being a bit too over aggressive on his overtake down into turn 17 at the end of the straight, which unfortunately his penalty probably warranted because he lost control of the car, which resulted in Piastri's front wing being damaged. But we want to see fair and clean racing, and still not entirely happy with these further clarifications that have been detailed here, which me and Brad got kind of very heated about before, and we'll get through now.
So where is the displeasure from? Is it just that it is so specific that it means that drivers have to continuously be thinking about, am I alongside enough? Or is there another motivation behind why these don't seem like a great way to police driving?
I think, in short, the main gripe most of us have about these current rules is that once a driver is sufficiently alongside on the inside, they don't have to leave any space for the driver that's on the outside. They don't have to leave any room whatsoever for the defending driver. And that's what we saw with Piastri versus Sainz. That's exactly what Sainz was annoyed about. And I was shouting at the TV saying, Carlos, these are the rules, man. Like, we don't like it, but you should have been saying this sooner. We were certainly protesting it privately and on social media the moment we realized this was the case. It's the fact that the driver who's attacking doesn't have to leave any room whatsoever on the outside. And the reason we don't like that is because it means that battles become single corner battles. If you can just shove the driver off track without penalty, without any need to let them back through afterwards, if that's a legitimate tactic which is codified in the rules, then we don't get to see battles. We get to see individual moves which are done and dusted in a single corner. And that's not what we like. We like to see fights continue for multiple corners with drivers able to be side by side, exchanging advantage and disadvantage depending on which side of the track they're on, which is why these further clarifications make things worse. And we can go into what they say, but essentially they go even further in stopping these multi-corner battles, which is strange, to say the least, in a series where we thought we were trying to encourage overtaking.
And that kind of perfectly brings us into the case study of Magnuson versus Sargent, where you go off track, Sargent's race was done, and a huge part of that was because, Sargent shifted to the right. He was entitled to that space because he was ahead according to these rules, but it just didn't lead to good racing.
Yes, well, as a number of people have seen, probably the on-balls from both Sargent and Magnuson, they were battling for around half a lap prior to their incidents. So they had a bit of a tangle going down the back straight. And then, of course, it's all down to that run into turn one, where Sargent went defensive. Magnuson lined up the cutback, sufficiently did so. But turns 1, 2, and 3 are S's. They're very quick. What we see similar at like Maggots and Beckett's and so forth, not as severe. So you go in, out, in, and then Magnuson got great traction from that cutback, lines up the overtake round the outside of turn 2 for the inside of turn 3. But Logan Sargent turns in to turn 3 while Kevin Magnuson has his front axle alongside his cockpit. So it's not at the front. So he's not fully what you'd say side by side, but he is, I think, for most individuals and most fans of F1 would say is sufficiently alongside to warrant racing room. And of course, they came together with Logan Sargent turning into that corner and Magnuson being as tight as possible.
Yeah, so I want to explain why the stewards penalised Magnuson and then point out why it isn't a good thing, why he shouldn't have been penalised, essentially. So, as Scott just described, Magnuson went for a cutback into the first corner, which led him to be on the outside for the second corner, which he then knew would mean he would be in position on the inside of the third corner to be, to make a move around the inside. Brilliant. That's what we want to see. Multi-corner moves. This is the thing I said that we were going to be starved of, as per the guidelines. So this is great. This is working well at this point. But the stewards deemed that because Magnuson didn't have his front wheels alongside the front wheels of Sargent around the outside, that he then wasn't entitled to any room on the inside of the following corner, which is bizarre as far as I'm concerned. Magnuson was always partially alongside and was very much alongside at the point of contact, and then it was judged against him. But it was judged against him because he wasn't far enough alongside at the previous corner, which really doesn't make any sense because he has fulfilled the criteria for a car being on the inside, attacking on the inside. It's just that because it flowed from an outside move, they said he wasn't alongside enough there. So the way these moves should be judged, and this would be really simple to implement, in my opinion, is, and I spoke to the guys before the show, so I've practiced this line. If you are making a move, or if you're defending from a move, we should look at, were you allowed to do the thing you were doing? So was Magnuson, before contact happened, was he allowed to be on the inside of Sargent around that right-hander, turn 3? And until they made contact, absolutely, he was allowed to be there, and Sargent was allowed to be next to him. And then you'd look at the point of contact, what could the drivers have done differently to avoid the contact? So Magnuson, at the point of contact, was fully on the right, wasn't understeering wide, maintaining a consistent tight line. He couldn't lift off because the wheels were interlocked, and the wheels were interlocked because of Sargent's actions, not because of Magnuson's. So Magnuson couldn't lift off. That would have caused a crash where Sargent would have driven over his front wheels. He couldn't move any further right because he was already fully on the right. And obviously he couldn't move left because Sargent was on the left. So Magnuson, in that situation, could do nothing differently, and he was allowed to be there. Sargent could have stopped turning right, had the whole track to the left to use, and again, couldn't have backed out, couldn't have lifted off because the same problem would have occurred. They've got interlocked wheels. So the only person who could have done something differently was Sargent. Magnuson was legitimately there, not doing anything he wasn't allowed to do, yet it was still ruled against him because of what we just mentioned about something which happened at the previous corner. And I think maybe in this situation, because of what happened the previous day, because I think Magnuson was just in the steward's bad books at Miami because of his sprint race antics. And maybe, although this shouldn't be the case, maybe these incidents weren't judged separately and it was just on the face of it, one car's in the barrier, one car continues. It must have been the car that continued's fault, and Magnuson's already been naughty this weekend. So that's my view, but I think it was judged incorrectly even by the updated guidelines, and the updated guidelines suck, in my opinion.
From reading the updated guidelines, for me, it very much did seem like, provide some insight here. Are we happy with the turn on the outside, turn on the inside overtaking rule, and it's just the way that they've merged them together to not account for how S's and continuing corner into corner are different, and how essentially you would need a different rule for, were you giving enough space for while you're approaching an overtake, as opposed to just considering each corner an opportunity for an overtake?
I think so, and that's partly what these new guidelines are doing, is to try and determine more specific scenarios, specifically the S's and the incident we saw with Sargent and Magnuson. But I think it's just a simple solution. Like if someone's got their rear wheel alongside, maybe not the rear wheel, but let's say they've got their front wheel ahead of their rear wheel, then of the defending car, then they're entitled to racing room, and you always have to leave a car's width. What these rules are going to do is we're just going to start seeing processions through certain corners, and we're going to see certain parts of the track never have overtaking, which you're asking racing drivers not to race. Their instinct, no matter what the corner, they don't see any corner in any circuit as not being able to do an overtake. Look at the two Alpines go through the marina and the chicane side by side, something that we never thought we would ever see. Yet they did it, and they did it cleanly and thankfully got through it. But we shouldn't have this scenario of certain corners we're never going to see overtakes on, because otherwise we're just going to be devoid of those moments, those multi-corner battles where we look at it and go, oh my God, wow, how good was that? Look back to Hamilton and Rosberg at Bahrain, those camera angles when they went side by side for the S's. And okay, a little bit of nudging off by Hamilton at certain corners, but for the most part, they went wheel to wheel pretty fairly. And it was like heart in mouth moment. And we don't want to be devoid of those. And this is just what these rules are going to implement, is the complete opposite to what we want.
Drivers in battle, particularly in the fastest open wheel sport in the world, they're not able to measure, oh, was my front wheel exactly alongside his mirror? It's silly. It shouldn't work like that. It's so simple. If you just judge it in the same way that you judge someone swinging their fists around nearby you, the point at which you have to stop swinging your fist is when it reaches my face. If you go further than that, it's your fault. You've made contact. And the way cars move towards one another on a track, you have to stop moving when you reach the other car. Whoever is moving towards whom at a greater rate is the one more responsible for an incident. And it could be so easily made into a rule, or at least you could make such a simple diagram and explanation in a driver briefing saying, if someone has a part of their car alongside you and it's there legitimately, so I don't mean a dive bomb at the last moment when the driver ahead had no hope of knowing you were coming. I mean, if someone was there for any significant amount of time and it's a legitimate move and we agree they were allowed to be in the position they're in, if there's an overlap, you have to stop moving towards that direction when you get to the overlap. And that works for everyone. That's the attacker, that's the defender, and that allows all moves at all corners, and everyone has to not drive off the track or be forced off the track. And currently, the rules say you have to be a very specific amount alongside if you want to go around the outside. If you're on the inside, then you can run the person off on the outside. And drivers simply... We're getting to see that more and more. People are taking those opportunities now, as we saw with Piastri, because it's allowed. But the longer this goes on, the less finesse we're going to see in the moves we do see, and the fewer good quality battles we're going to see because of what we've just spoken about with not being allowed essentially to overtake in certain parts of the track.
I think with these rules as well, the FIA are asking these drivers to be very specific in the largest cars in F1 history, with the largest blind spots in F1 history. Wouldn't it be better to err on the side of caution and say, if you even instinctively think that someone is alongside you, I'm sure Sargent didn't completely think that he fully cleared Magnuson. I'm sure even in the cockpit of those cars, he would have known, especially Magnuson being as far up alongside as he was, but he would have known he was at least there. And to err on the side of caution and ensure that you always leave racing room is just kind of the simple solution, which, look, when the cars get smaller gradually over time, the new regs are starting to go back in that direction. But even with the larger mirrors that have been introduced, we've got tyres that are the largest we've seen on F1 cars. They can't see into apexes. But it's too specific at the moment. And I think that's not being taken into consideration, because we see more and more of these moves where drivers are turning into apexes or turning into corners because the blind spots are larger than ever.
I honestly think I've heard better briefings at rental karting events where the race director will say effectively, if you're not 100% sure that you've got the room to close the door, then you have to err on the side of caution. If you don't know there's someone not next to you, if you don't know you've got the room to go to the apex, act as if you don't have the room. And that works for everyone. And that then encourages, well, certainly less contact. And it means the onus is on everyone to leave space, and then battles can develop. And if you do turn in and you're wrong, if you got it wrong and there was someone in that gap and you happen to get spun out because of your own actions like that, then it's self-policing. Don't expect a penalty for the other person because they were existing in a space that you drove into. And if you damage their race, if you break their car with your turning across on them, assuming they weren't there when they were, then you might get the penalty. And at the moment, the F1 regulations are the opposite way around to that. They're saying effectively you can do the silly thing, and the person who was doing something completely legitimate that was allowed, they're going to be getting the penalty. So it seems completely backwards at every step.
And it seems like it also leads to kind of the chaos that we got to see from Kevin Magnuson, where he understood what the rules were and kind of just tossed caution to the wind, not just in terms of where he was placing his car, but also just knowing he would be getting penalties and going with it. And this is where we have a submission, a question from a viewer, and it sounds like a Patreon supporter, so thank you for that. It is coming from Mason, asking about all the Kevin Magnuson talk over the Miami weekend and how drivers are allowed to intentionally commit penalizable actions, because yes, they get penalty points, but no real big consequence comes until potentially race bans, which happen after you get 12 of those massive points. And Mason is wondering if it makes more sense to have gradual punishments, so that way you're actually getting, a little bit of a beatdown before you get to that race penalty. And quite frankly, especially with the quote we got from Kevin Magnuson saying, yes, this is something that I was intentionally doing, it very much does feel like there should be an option to penalize this kind of behavior ahead of time while it's actively happening, so that way it doesn't continue throughout an entire race weekend. And so that way drivers don't feel so comfortable to straight up admit it to cameras that that's what they were doing.
So I just want to point out the Magnuson sprint race moves, certainly some of them were not in keeping with any guidelines or even my own view of what should be allowed. And the reason is he was essentially keeping position by driving off track, which again shouldn't be allowed. This is in the opposite direction from what we were talking about with the legitimate overtakes and what should be allowed. Magnuson was knowingly going for unwinnable moves, knowing that he could physically get track position illegally, would then pick up a penalty for that, but the penalty wouldn't be big enough to be a deterrent from him doing it again, because he had the motive of allowing his teammate to stay further ahead, whatever, and he knew that he wouldn't be penalized sufficiently that it would affect him. He didn't like doing it. He said it afterwards, but he was kind of playing. He was using his penalties up as he was allowed to, effectively, even though those individual moves were not allowed. They weren't on. So again, there is easily a way to fix this, and that would have been an immediate drive-through penalty, for example, instead of a post-race time penalty, a drive-through penalty which would then clear him out of the way of the cars he had illegitimately overtaken. There's also, you could have the threat of much bigger punishments like a black flag or a ban, rather than allowing drivers to do it multiple times, and eventually maybe you'll get a black flag or just a time penalty later. All the while, the driver you've illegally overtaken is being massively inconvenienced or even damaged. Magnuson rejoined and crashed into the side of Hamilton on one of the moves. But yeah, I think there's an easy way around that. Again, no idea why we're not doing that.
Yeah, totally agree. And what we saw of Magnuson in that sprint race was akin to what you see in online racing. And there's a reason why there's gradual on iRacing, just to compare it to that. They have a gradual incident limits for more points for car contact and spins and so forth. And of course, it's not necessarily the same implementation of what you do in real life. But if you get too many points throughout the race, you then exceed that limit and get a drive-through penalty. So that's obviously in F1. If you're deemed to have clearly have broken the rules a couple of times, that Magnuson did, rather than those initial time penalties, the easiest way is just to remove him from that situation and give him a drive-through. It's an instant penalty that also results in them Hulkenberg or his teammate not benefiting because it frees the cars behind to crack on and close that gap down. And it's instant rather than these post race penalties. I think Magnuson's probably opened a can of worms there, and I'm sure the FIA are looking at it. If they're not looking at it, why? But they need to, because we know these drivers, as we just saw mentioning Piastri with Sainz, these drivers are going to take any opportunity that they can. And especially down the back end where it's a lot closer this year and tighter to getting those last points in the championship. What's to say that Daniel Ricciardo or Yuki Tsunoda isn't deployed to get those tactics for VCARB or Stake F1? I don't know. But it was, at least it provided some drama.
I don't see how any, and maybe this is because they're not professionals, maybe this is volunteers doing this, but I don't see how any professional race director couldn't see the kind of moves Magnuson were doing. You know, say you watch him do a move which you deem to not be legal, but he has gained track position from it. Why on earth would you not immediately be on the radio to the team saying, give the position back? If you don't give the position back within half a lap or 1 lap or whatever, if you want to be super lenient, 3 laps, but that's way too long, give the position back. If you don't, you're getting a black flag. Simple as that. That's it. That removes any problem. And for every half a lap you don't give it back, there's another 5-second penalty post race. But it's easy. You get that car out of that position. That's what happens in basically every other form of motorsport. This isn't like, I'm not coming up with a wild idea here. If I went down to a local go-kart circuit and bumped someone out of the way, which is a similar thing to, because there's no damage in that kind of rental karting, it's a similar thing to dive bombing someone, going off the track and then staying in front because you went past off the track. You would never then be allowed to keep the position if you're in an organized race. The race director would just tell you, give the position back, or they put a black and white flag out, which was like immediate penalty in the pit, whatever. There are so many options available, better than what they actually chose to do.
I'm going to be really conspiratorial here, and I think they let that go on because Max was out up front in the sprint race, and Magnuson wasn't only doing this against any driver, he was doing this against Lewis Hamilton. And it provided a level of entertainment that we have been devoid of for a while. And the fact of that he was doing it against Lewis, see, massive in America, Lewis is as a person himself and a brand. And everyone was talking about it on social media. Everyone. And post-race as well, it was talked about for quite a while, even more so than Max winning and Charles coming second, even more so than Daniel Ricciardo finishing 4th and holding off Sainz and Piastri. So I think there was, being cynical and conspiratorial there, I think they did it for the entertainment purposes, and I think that was a conscious decision. But it can't be allowed to continue further forward. I mean, some people probably neutrals, people who don't necessarily tune into the sport that much, and just tuned in for Miami because it is a big event in the US, the first US event of the year. Probably really enjoyed that and were thinking, oh my God, this is absolutely crazy. But for us who watch the sport on the regular, we know that just wasn't on, and a harsher penalty should be dished out for that.
Apparently it was just hard racing though, according to the commentary I heard.
Like everything else.
Well, Brad is ready to be race director. He will totally not get drunk with power. He will be a just, quick, and swift ruler. Quite frankly, I think he'd make a great race director. I would love to see that. And yes, whenever we get to the slight conspiracy theories, they do seem outlandish. But then we also think for a moment that, some of the craziest things in Formula One history happened because somebody thought it was a good idea to go to a public office supply store and get photocopies done. So nothing is quite out of the realm of possibility when it comes to this sport. But we will move on from this contentious topic. I feel like the wind has been blown a little out of your sails. You've gotten that energy out. Are we feeling good? We've let it We've let our voices be heard on it. And now we can talk about a fun little advancement that we're getting another update on, which is that Ferrari were seen testing what kind of looks like little Lego piece hubcaps on top of their car, which are the wheel covers, rain covers, that are going to be designed, trialed in order to see if we can reduce some of the spray. Now, we know the majority of the spray does come from the diffuser, so there's only so much of an impact that these wheel covers are going to make, but we're trying another prototype. This is the second one that we're getting, and they are much bigger and bulkier than the last ones we saw.
Yeah, so if anyone's not seen these photos, which are all over Formula One social media today, as Cristina described, they're pretty large appendages made of carbon fiber over each of the wheels, kind of similar to some of the advanced F1 concept cars you might have seen, like the Adrian Newey, whatever it was called, the Red Bull with the closed cockpit and the covered in wheels. Kind of one step towards that, although clearly not as aerodynamic as some of those fairings, because the covers effectively go around the tire and they don't have any aero on the front or the rear. It's just the shape, it's just a circle, just the shape of the tire. And from everything we could see on the photos where they tested in the wet, at least, because I think they did some dry running as well, the spray was definitely still there. There was actually quite a dramatic increase in outwash spray. So it was almost like the spray coming from the edge of the tire, which was exposed, just the very bottom, essentially, was being thrown out to the side quite dramatically. And there was still a lot of spray hanging in the air. I would say certainly not enough of an improvement in spray, even with one car running, to justify fitting these for a wet race. And as you mentioned, the diffuser has still not been looked at, I don't think. The first wheel covers we saw tested at Silverstone, I believe, last year, were very, very small, and they had literally no effect. So there was zero difference. It was essentially useless, but that was the first step. This will have had certainly a bigger change. They will learn something from it, but I still don't think we're there. And I think the diffuser is what is throwing up the majority of the spray.
Who would have thought that cars that predominantly create their downforce from the floor of the car throws up more spray? I mean, this seems like a massive oversight of when the new regulations were introduced or proposed. And yeah, we're suffering from it because I don't ever remember us having this lack of wet weather running ever in F1 since these new regulations. Yes, towards the end of the old regulations, they were becoming very keen on obviously safety reasons, not allowing running and starting of wet races. A lot of them were starting under the safety car, but I don't think the spray was ever as severe as what it is now. The two concepts they've run are open and closed concepts, so obviously just gathering some data points quite evidently. But yeah, I don't think these are the answer. While they will reduce the spray to an extent, one, what is the final design? The final design's got to be suitable for pit stops, for the pit crew to get these off. I mean, if you see the concepts that have been run today, pit stops are going to go from being 2.5 seconds to 3 seconds to being 12 to 13, possibly even more with how these have been bolted on by the looks of it. But yeah, I just think more needs to be looked at the underside of the car, more so than the actual wheels. And with them still finalising the aero regulations of 2026, I think the engine is pretty much sealed. But this is something that I think they need to be looking at to reduce how that spray comes out through the diffuser and through the floor that creates the downforce.
Can I just be slightly controversial here and say I don't think this has a solution? I think this is a massive waste of time. As someone who has raced in lots of different race series at much lower speeds than Formula One, in cars with fully covered wheels and no real diffuser throwing up spray to speak of, you have zero visibility when it's wet. I've had windscreen wipers, been traveling at 150 miles an hour instead of 200 miles an hour, as I say, with wheels fully covered, you still cannot see a thing. Just I've got some videos on. Check out my YouTube video, my first BTCC race, and you'll see in that race absolutely zero visibility, just white out in front of you, and that's with everything fully covered. Cars traveling over a wet surface at any kind of speed throw up a massive amount of spray. It's how it is. The faster they go, the more spray they throw up. If you've ever driven on the motorway at 60 or 70 miles per hour behind even a single car in any significant rain, the visibility is terrible. And I think they are chasing something which is impossible to find an answer to. And I think it's exacerbated by the fact that, as Stuffey pointed out, we're in a regulation set where the diffuser, the underfloor of the car, is producing a lot of your grip. When you're traveling slower, like you do in the wet, you have a lot less grip. The cars have to be run stiffer, so they're not very good at low speeds anyway, even in the dry. And when you take away grip by the surface being slippery, they've got even less grip. So you've got this kind of confluence of factors where, yeah, visibility is terrible. It's always terrible, but maybe it's even slightly worse with the way the cars are now. And they've got less grip, so then less confidence to save things in the smaller amount of time they have to react because of the bad visibility. I just don't think it's going to go away. I think the thing that will fix it to a degree is better wet weather tyres, because there's always been complaints about the Pirelli wet weather tyres just not really being up to scratch. And, you know, a regulation set where you're not fully dependent on underfloor downforce for the majority of your grip.
How about we just make the tyres smaller again, so there's less surface area, and we make the cars smaller again, so they're throwing off less spray? Hey, nice simple solution. We've gone, once again, we're heading back to the issue of these current cars where they're too big all round, and we've come to this situation where, yeah, they're potentially chasing the impossible, as Brad's just said, and the solution is just to make them smaller again. But there's more room as well on the circuit. One of these F1 cars, as we saw with Charles Leclerc spinning it in the first practice session, these F1 cars are so long, but one of these cars loses it in the rain. I get why there's a safety concern and why they are seeking it. But we need to just head back and dial things back a bit in regards to the tyre size and the size of the cars. And naturally, that will reduce this issue and we'll see more wet weather racing.
Speaking of safety concerns, which safety features, one of my favorite topics when it comes to Formula One because of how the specific engineering works. With these things, I imagine you'd also be adding some weight to the tires and how they'd have to re-engineer how a tire tether potentially is working because of the added safety, the added weight. Can these things easily come detached? Which, you don't like tires to go flying. I can't imagine you would like one of these things to go flying. And my other big question is, you go wheel to wheel in wet weather, things are more unpredictable. You smash into one of these things and more carbon fiber is going flying all over the place than you would normally have when you tap tire to tire. This, yes, most likely is just them collecting data points and seeing the two far extremes of what these things could look like. But the more I think about these things, the more wild and crazy it seems like they're chasing their tails of looking for a solution to which there just currently isn't one because of these types of cars.
I think you're right that these aren't a complete solution as we've seen them now. Even if they were working, even if they'd solved the problem, and the photos we saw clearly show it hasn't. But if there was zero spray coming out of these cars, I still think you'd see quite a lot of development in exactly how it was implemented. Because, yeah, as you point out, it's something else to fall off. It's something that's attached to the extremity of the car, which is already pretty big. You've made it slightly wider. If you're going to touch anyone else's car, it's going to be on one of those things. If one of them gets broken or falls off, are they obliged to pit immediately? Like, how much damage before you have to pit? All that kind of stuff. And yeah, I don't think they're at the end point at all. If they do decide that this is the route they're going to take.
My other question is that with these wheeled covers, we were assuming that their big design plan was to just have the spray stay low down to the ground. But that would mean that it would take more time for the racing line to dry off. So would this become a situation where you have to develop in tandem with Pirelli new wet weather tires and wheel covers at the same time, so that way they work together to achieve the desirable goal of having less spray, but still a dry racing line?
I don't think the racing line's an issue because the drivers can deal with wet weather racing, driving on the wet line. It's more so the visibility. The visibility is what they're trying to reduce, because at the moment the rain lights, they can only make them so strong, and all you have to do is just look at a few of the onboards of them trudging around at Spa, which we've had wet races there previously, of how much lack of visibility it is. It's purely a safety concern, not so much them a safety concern in regards to them not being able to drive on wet weather or in the wet conditions, because the drivers have been doing this throughout their whole time in karting, in the junior formulas as well. They're familiar with this, so yeah, it's interesting. Hopefully, it's just they look at the data and they realise there's just no solution to this. The only solution is to just gradually. I mean, I'd much rather accept that we see minimal wet racing over the next year or so, and then make sufficient changes in the technical regulations to try and reduce this. I just don't see how this concept is going to work from a practical sense and from a health and safety sense as well. And quite evidently, that the main objective of reducing the spray is having minimal effect from these concepts anyway. But even so, I mean, what other type of concepts can you put around? I mean, what other concepts can you put around tires? I don't really know. I'm not a designer. I'm not an engineer. But it just seems like it's a bit of wasted time and effort, and it's better suited just looking at how reducing this by changing the cars as a whole in the future.
Make F1 cars teeny tiny again. Smaller, lighter cars. Groundbreaking. Another little test session that we had going this week was that, shock of shock, Kimmy Antonelli has gotten more time in a Formula One car. So we had both Russell and Antonelli in a test at Silverstone in the W13, which, if for anybody who has difficulty with counting and keeping track, as I kind of do, that is the 2022 car. So the first car in the ground effects era, because it is one of the old era cars now, not current eras, which means that Antonelli can drive it to his heart's content and not be limited by testing time. So we have Russell as a benchmark, Antonelli getting in his lap times and experience. And it does look like they're preparing him for Formula One, which we know it has to happen. Antonelli will end up in Formula One at one point or another, but the big question is, when is the timing going to be right? When are they going to have properly put him through a prep and training regime? Because Formula One is not a series that you can easily learn on the go for. You really do have to arrive ready to hit the ground running.
They are putting a lot of eggs in Kimmy Antonelli's basket, quite evidently. And for viewers, listeners out there, I would take what James Vowles and Toto Wolff had said about him not being in a Williams seat with the smallest pinch of salt, because don't ever trust what comes out of their mouths. They wouldn't be going through all of this testing, claiming a super license, if they wasn't eyeing him up for him to go into F1 this year. I just don't see why you'd do all this testing now for next year. You would much better just let him concentrate on F2. I know I get F2 has limited running, but it's just there's too much effort going in at the moment with his tests at Imola and in the W12 and the W13, and another one with a direct comparison with George Russell, of all people, a future teammate. So yeah, he's definitely going to be in Mercedes and in F1. It's more so if than when. Maybe they're striking out the finer details. Supposedly, I think James Vowles is not completely rolling over to Toto Wolff's requests. He's only going to take Antonelli if he can have him for 2 years, not just 6 months to a year. But I think Toto's eyeing him up for some use the rest of this season as almost a practice season for him in Williams, and then promote him early into 2025 with Lewis Hamilton's going away, because I think they see him as their next Verstappen, and that's quite clear of all these tests.
I agree with Stuffey that it's quite a lot of work to be putting into this driver if you're not considering getting him into F1 imminently. I would say for the people who are saying that he hasn't really done much in Formula 2 yet, I'd say there hasn't really been a lot of Formula 2 this year, and Mercedes don't have time to sit back and just wait and see how the F2 season plays out. And it's not the be all and end all anyway. We've seen plenty of drivers who have gone on to be extremely good in Formula 1 skip Formula 2 altogether. Kimi Räikkönen went from Formula Renault, which was essentially, for anyone who's new to the sport, it was similar to Formula 4 level now, directly into Formula 1. Antonelli has already won at that level, won multiple championships at that level, and has then skipped Formula 3 and is showing well in Formula 2. He's already very, very credible in Formula 2. I think they might have seen enough outside of that to know that they don't have to hinge his entire F1 debut potential on this season's Formula 2 championship. They might say, yeah, okay, he's shown enough. We haven't had time to see the Formula 2 story play out, but it doesn't need to. We know he's good enough. We know if we left him in for another season, he'd be the champion. Why wait? Why not just get him in as soon as we can?
Especially because we've heard from Formula 1 drivers who have been in Formula 2 and current Formula 2 drivers who have tested the F1 cars in FP1 sessions. We've heard from them that F2 is not the proper prep to be in Formula 1. There is still too much of a gap between F2 to F1. You just need time in a Formula 1 car at the end of the day. So, you can say it's unfortunate that he hasn't had the time to fully concentrate and commit to Formula 2, but realistically, that is just good experience, but it is not the proper preparation that you would take to be in Formula 1. The only thing you can do to get ready to be on that particular grid is to drive the car, is to do practice sessions, FP1 sessions, and fun little nugget that I'm also going to add in right here is that it's not just the full super license you need to be 18 to get, it's also the free practice only super license to get. So I would love for us to specifically get the clarification on if they requested the full super license or if it was the free practice only and it's just that they're just saying the words super license.
And I have to say, I think this 18 and above super license rule is a little bit silly because it was brought in because of Max Verstappen, who started obviously very early. Was it 16? He did his first test, and the whole thing's been proven to be silly because Max has gone on to be incredibly good. So that surely proves that the rule didn't need to be there. And if you're good enough, you're old enough. And I think if you took any Formula 3 level driver and you said, right, we can either give you a season or half a season of prep in a Formula 1 car for your first Formula 1 season, or you can do a season in Formula 2, I think they'd all take the Formula 1 prep because it is more relevant. Formula 2 as a season of racing is great if you can't get into Formula 1 yet. And obviously, you're going to continue learning racecraft. The speed is higher than Formula 4 and Formula 3, obviously. So it's better to be doing that than doing nothing. But if you've got an option to be in a Formula 1 car already, and you're physically capable of driving it, and you're good enough to handle the car, then it can't be a bad thing to be practicing in that car. Speed is relative. It only takes a couple of sessions for drivers to become accustomed to that speed. And from there on, they're learning all the complexities, how much setup difference there is, all the tools you have on the steering wheel. I'd much rather be doing that than, learning more racecraft in a Formula 2 car when you've probably done, a decade of racing in other series before. You're not going to be learning that much more about how to position a car in battle, for example.
Most recently, Liam Lawson massively described the benefits of him moving over to Super Formula for a season, moving away from F2. He said the differences for Super Formula was the speeds were a bit closer to F1 through the corners than Formula 2. And he also said setting up the car in F2 is, they've changed now to a new style, new concept. So it's ground effect, so it's closer in regards to how it performs to F1. But they're still basic in how they set up the car. Whereas Liam Lawson said when he went over to Super Formula, the more intricacy and the more detail that was required to set up the cars and to gain performance massively helped him when he went to AlphaTauri for half a season. But I will say, look at Kimmy Antonelli. He does need to improve on his will-to-will, though, because he couldn't overtake me in iRacing in the Super Formula Light. So Toto, if you're listening, sorry, I must have missed your voicemail for that test at Silverstone today.
Brad is going to be a race director. Stuffey is going to be driving the Mercedes next year. We have all of our plans lined up. It is going to be fantastic. Another thing that we could fantastically plan to do next year is all of Missed Apex can go to Miami and split a $280 lobster roll. Apparently, though, it is for multiple people, which is why the whole of Missed Apex could definitely split that giant lobster roll. I do have to say, though, even though it is for sharing with people, for $280, that better be a dang good lobster roll, because the whole team is going to have to contribute to eating that and getting the money's worth of it.
Yeah, saw this going around. This went around, I think, last year as well, and it is more so on the VIP, the corporate section, for a bit of context. So it's mostly people putting it on their business cards and who are there just for a good time. So they know they can hike up the prices. However, I will say, while I have never been fortunate enough to attend the Grand Prix, I know, Brad, I know, never, absolutely never. I know you're shocked. I have seen plenty of images and messages from people who have gone and who have shown me how expensive trackside food and drink and merchandise can be, and I think it's just an indication of how expensive the sport is for the fan, whether that be away from the circuit, from just paying for TV coverage, or paying for merchandise from the teams online, and then that's added on for the tax for being trackside as well.
As everyone will know, if you're a proper VIP, you don't pay for your food at all. So the fact that they were having to pay at all means it can't have been very VIP, as Spanners and I found out when we were guests of Estrella Galathea at Silverstone with Ferrari, where you just walked in and you were being handed drinks and food the entire time. So that's proper VIP. I think if you go to a race like Miami, you're going to just expect to pay loads of money for everything. Even when you're at a standard European traditional venue, everything's always really expensive. It's always a running joke, how much money a burger is at, so a normal burger van, baseball caps costing upwards of £60. It's kind of unfortunately how it is. And it's been like that a long time. It's probably more expensive now than ever, but it's never been cheap to attend a Grand Prix. It's like slightly more prohibitively expensive now. But yeah, I think that is a little bit misleading, that photo in Miami of the lobster rolls. But you guys can have more because my portion, because I'm a vegetarian anyway, so I don't want any of that. It's made of animals.
Add that to the list of stories I heard multiple times over the Miami weekend, was Brad being a vegetarian, that you guys got VIP treatment at Silverstone. The list goes on and on. If I had a nickel for every time I heard some of these stories, I'd have
Spanners was in Miami.
Did we know that Spanners was in Miami? Did we? Oh my goodness. I never would have thought. I was also in Miami. It was great. And for anybody who would like the added context, as someone who is in Miami will know, the cost of a Red Bull trackside for the smaller of the two options of cans that you can get was $8. So about 4 times the price of what I could get a can for in the grocery store. Definitely expensive, but when you're only there for 3 days, it was a manageable expense, I will say. Most people, I think, also only eat trackside once a day. You eat breakfast before you leave, the one lunch, and then you are home for the evening. Now,
I just want to point out, just before we finish this particular topic, if you are attending a live race and you're being charged £15 for a burger or whatever, don't be too mad at the vendor selling it, because they're having to charge that much to justify the absolutely extortionate rates they will be being charged to have their plot at the track, which in turn is being charged to them by the circuit, because Formula One is charging the circuit a ridiculous amount to host the race. So blame Formula One themselves rather than the burger man.
Damn Liberty Media.
Charging us right, left, and center for the absolute pleasure of enjoying Formula One trackside, seeing Lando Norris get his first win. Before we before we head out for the day, I just want to ask you guys, as people who are watching at home, was there still just a whole bunch of energy? Because trackside, everyone was cheering for Norris every single lap he came around. What was the experience for you guys watching just not by the track?
I was doing my live watch along and I saw the numbers creep up a lot at the end when people realised, especially after the safety car, when people realised, oh, Lando could have an opportunity of winning this. So it showed the intrigue that everyone got from that possibility and eventuality. And yeah, it was in the chat and so forth, and even myself included, we saw the gap just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're thinking, he could do this, he could do this. And then you saw Oscar Piastri sending it on people at the end, and you're just thinking, no, no, no. So there was plenty of energy at home. And yeah, my partner as well, who was watching in the other room, came in and was like, oh my God, I can't believe he won, someone other than Max. So yeah, and then even at work, a couple of days, the day afterwards or after bank holiday, people just instantly going, did you watch it at the weekend? So yeah, it was definitely a new winner, and someone as likable as Lando. It definitely got a lot of eyes on the sport.
Phenomenal thing to experience, phenomenal thing to see, just like it is phenomenal to hear a new episode of Missed Apex each and every time you go and try to find us. So we've had a lovely time chit-chatting today for this mailbag episode. Talked a little bit about Miami again. Took a look at driving standards and the Ferrari test of the wet wheel covers. We've had Stuffey on and Brad, and you can find all of their social medias linked down below. Thank you for joining us today. We might be wrong, but we're first.